I never imagined that my life would change that day. It wasn't supposed to mean anything, just a simple ride home with James, my husband's colleague. I had known him for years, seen him at company events, but he was always just someone passing in the background, polite but unremarkable. When he offered to drive me home that afternoon, I didn't think much of it. But as we drove through the quiet streets, something shifted. It wasn't the ride itself, but the way he looked at me, the way he listened. There was something in his gaze that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't in years. And then, out of nowhere, he asked me a question that stopped me cold. "Do you ever wonder if you're still seen?" His voice wasn't forceful or accusing, just curious. But that simple question shook me to the core. I had spent so many years in the shadow of my roles, wife, mother, that I hadn't even realized how invisible I had become. I wasn't sure how to answer, or even what it meant. All I knew was that in that moment, something inside me stirred, something I had long buried. It wasn't just the question itself, but the way it made me see my life. The mask I had worn for so long, the woman who had quietly disappeared into her routine, was suddenly in question. It felt like everything I had built my identity around was unraveling, just with one simple sentence. I sat at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee, feeling the gentle heat seep into my palms. The morning fog had settled over Asheville, the town I'd called home for over 2 decades. The air was thick with the quiet of dawn, the kind of stillness that felt like time itself was holding its breath. Outside, the world was waking up, but inside, everything remained unchanged. It was as if the same fog had wrapped itself around my life, blurring the edges of everything, distant but close enough to suffocate. Davis had already left for work, just like every other morning. He had his routine, his meetings, his own world that seemed to grow more distant with each passing year. I had once been the center of that world, or so I had believed. Now it was just a series of silent mornings. The clink of his coffee cup on the counter, the rustle of papers as he gathered his things, the sound of the front door closing softly behind him. All routine, all mechanical. I couldn't remember the last time we'd had a conversation that wasn't about schedules, bills, or the kids. Our children were grown now, living their own lives far away. I should have felt pride in their independence, but instead, there was a hollow ache whenever I thought of them. The house, once full of noise and chaos, was now too quiet. The empty rooms echoed in the stillness. Their old bedrooms had turned into guest rooms, untouched by the passage of time, just like everything else in this house. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate the peace. I had always been someone who valued order, who loved the simplicity of a well-kept home and a predictable life. But there was something missing, something I couldn't put into words. The days felt like a loop, playing over and over in my mind. Breakfast, laundry, dishes, grocery lists. I went through the motions, each task blending into the next, but there was no feeling of fulfillment, no spark that had once made these routines feel meaningful. I had become a shadow of the woman I used to be. At one point, I had been passionate, lively, someone who dreamed of more than just a tidy house and an empty nest. But now, it felt as though I had settled into a life I didn't recognize. The woman I was now wasn't someone I could identify with anymore. I had become someone else entirely. Someone who was merely existing, not living. I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it had happened. Maybe it was after the kids left for college, or maybe it was when Davy and I stopped talking about anything more than the day-to-day tasks. Whatever it was, I knew that I was no longer the person I had once been. I was the woman who made sure dinner was on the table, who kept the house in perfect order, but who had lost touch with any sense of excitement or joy. I glanced around the kitchen, the warm, familiar space that had been the heart of our home. The table in front of me was polished, The chairs neatly arranged, everything in its place. It should have been comforting, but instead, it felt cold. Even the coffee in my hands had lost its warmth. I had become a ghost of the life I had once cherished, and I wasn't sure when I had begun to fade into the background. There were days when the silence was deafening. I'd stand in front of the mirror and wonder who the woman staring back at me was. Was she still the same person who used to dance around the kitchen to her favorite songs? The one who laughed so loud the neighbors could hear? Was she still the woman who had once dreamed of a life full of adventure, of feeling truly alive? Or had she become nothing more than the sum of her routines? It wasn't that I didn't love Davy. I did, deeply. But love had morphed into something predictable, something almost transactional. There was no thrill, no spark. We didn't need to talk anymore, not really. We knew each other too well, and maybe that was part of the problem. We had stopped trying to see each other. We had become two people sharing space, not sharing life. And I was beginning to wonder if that was enough. I finished my coffee and set the cup down on the counter. The morning stretched ahead, a blank canvas, just like the rest of the days before it. There was a strange comfort in that predictability, but also a deep, gnawing sadness. I was a woman who had lived her life for everyone else. For my children, for Davy, for the house. But when did I stop living for myself? I stood up and began clearing the table, moving through the motions like I always did. But something inside me stirred, something faint and distant. A feeling, a thought that I couldn't quite grasp, but I knew it was there. It had been growing quietly, beneath the surface, for a long time now. I just hadn't been ready to acknowledge it. Maybe I wasn't ready now. But there was one thing I was certain of. I couldn't go on like this forever. Something had to change. I wasn't sure what that change would look like, or even if it was something I wanted. But deep down, I knew that the silence, the routine, the emptiness, it wasn't enough anymore. I was more than this life I had created. And at some point, I was going to have to find that woman again. It happened on a Wednesday. I had just finished my weekly trip to the grocery store, the one where I tried to buy everything I thought we'd need for the week, all neatly organized and planned. My life was like that. Planned, predictable, organized. But as I started my car to head home, I felt a sickening thud and the engine sputtered to a stop. I cursed under my breath, gripping the steering wheel, and tried to turn the key again. Nothing. The car was dead. Of course, this would happen today, of all days. I didn't even know who to call at first. Davy was in back-to-back meetings at work, and my friends were all busy with their own lives. That's when I remembered James, Davy's colleague. I'd only spoken to him a handful of times at company gatherings or holiday parties, but I knew he worked nearby. He was younger than Davy, maybe in his early 30s, with dark hair and an easy confidence that was rare to see in men of his age. He always seemed polite, respectful, but a little distant, like he was always watching the world without fully engaging in it. I never gave him much thought before. He was just another person in Davy's life, a work friend. But now, stranded on the side of the road with a dead car, he seemed like my only option. I hesitated for a moment, unsure whether I should even ask. But then I remembered that James lived relatively close to me, and he often mentioned passing my street on his way home. It was worth a shot. I pulled out my phone and sent him a text. I didn't expect him to answer right away, but to my surprise, he replied almost instantly. "No problem, I'm on my way." I stood by the car, the morning sun already beating down, as I waited. The air was warm, but not yet unbearable. My heart raced, mostly from the inconvenience of it all, but also from the strange tension I felt. I had never been in a situation like this, where I was relying on someone I didn't know well, especially someone who was so closely tied to Davy. But the moment I saw James's car pull up, something inside me shifted. There was a calmness in him, an ease that immediately settled the edge of my nervousness. He got out of the car and smiled when he saw me. There was no awkwardness in his expression, no rush. He just seemed present, as though he had all the time in the world. "Need a lift?" he asked, his voice warm and steady. I nodded, trying to ignore the fluttering in my stomach. I wasn't sure why I felt this odd pull toward him. It wasn't like he was doing anything out of the ordinary. He was just helping me, offering a simple favor. But there was something in his demeanor, the way he moved, that made everything else feel less urgent, less stressful. I climbed into the passenger seat, still holding my purse tightly to my chest. I could feel my fingers trembling slightly, but I told myself it was just the inconvenience of the situation, nothing more. He shut the door gently, and we were off. I noticed his car was spotless, the interior neat, organized. Just like him, I supposed. His movements were precise, calculated, almost like he had everything figured out, even if the world around him felt chaotic. He drove calmly, never rushing, always keeping his focus on the road, and for some reason, that made me feel oddly safe. It was a kind of steadiness I hadn't realized I was missing in my own life. As we drove, I caught myself glancing at him more often than I should. I had never noticed how striking his profile was, or how his presence seemed to fill the car in a way that made it feel smaller, more intimate. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. It was different. The kind of silence where words weren't needed, but your thoughts ran wild anyway. I couldn't help but think about the contrast between him and Davy. Davy was always so wrapped up in his own world, always too busy for real conversations, too preoccupied with work or his own thoughts. But James, he was different. Even though we barely knew each other, he seemed to notice things about me that Davy hadn't in years. I could feel the warmth of his attention, the way he made an effort to ask about my day, how I was doing, without it feeling forced or out of obligation. It wasn't just politeness, it was genuine interest. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this simple drive, this small act of kindness, was doing something to me. It was reminding me of what it felt like to be seen, to be cared for in a way that went beyond the roles I had played for so long. Wife, mother, caretaker. I didn't know why I hadn't noticed it before, but for the first time in a long while, I felt like I was more than just the woman who cooked dinner and took care of the house. I was a person, a human being with needs and feelings, and for a fleeting moment, I felt like I mattered. As we neared my house, the comfortable familiarity of the street and my neighborhood began to calm the nervous energy I hadn't realized I was holding. I told myself it was just a ride, nothing more, but I couldn't ignore the way my heart beat a little faster whenever James glanced my way, the way I could still feel the weight of his attention, even in the quiet of the car. When we finally pulled up to my driveway, I felt a strange reluctance to leave. It was as if I didn't want the moment to end, this brief escape from the monotony of my life. I thanked James as I stepped out of the car, feeling a strange sense of regret that the ride was over. It was a fleeting moment, just an afternoon of small talk and quiet driving, but it had shifted something deep inside me, something I didn't fully understand yet. All I knew was that for the first time in years, I had felt like I was more than just a shadow in my own life. And that thought, that simple thought, lingered in my mind long after I walked back into the house. The drive home felt longer than it should have, the silence between us hanging thick in the air. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't easy either. I had never really noticed how heavy silence could feel until then, until I realized how often I had been living in it. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, glancing out the window at the passing trees, trying to distract myself from the strange flutter in my chest. James was polite, of course. He always had been. But there was something else now, something I couldn't name. It was as if his mere presence had become a quiet pressure, gently pushing me to confront feelings I'd long buried. He spoke again, his voice low and calm, almost as though he wasn't trying to draw attention to his words. "Do you ever wonder if you're still seen?" The words seemed to land in the car with a weight that made my breath catch. I stared at him, not sure if I had heard him right, if I had even understood what he meant. I wasn't sure how to respond. He wasn't asking if I felt loved or if I felt needed. He was asking if I was still visible. If, after all these years of blending into the roles of wife and mother, I still existed as something separate from those titles. Something that was just me. The question felt like a crack in the shell I had built around myself. For the first time in so long, I felt a sharp, uncomfortable awareness of how invisible I had become. Not just to others, but to myself. I had spent years focusing on my family, on making sure that everyone else was okay. Davy, the kids, the house. Everything revolved around them, around their needs. I was the quiet force behind it all, always in the background, always doing what was expected. I didn't mind it at first. In fact, I believed it was my purpose. I thought that somehow, in caring for everyone else, I was fulfilling my role. But now, with that simple question hanging in the air, I realized how much of myself I'd given up in the process, how much of me had disappeared. It wasn't just the weight of his words that hit me. It was the realization that, for years, I had allowed myself to fade into the background of my own life. I had become so consumed with being the wife, the mother, the caretaker, that I'd lost touch with the woman I once was. The woman who had dreams, passions, a sense of self beyond the labels I wore. When was the last time I'd done something for me? When had I allowed myself to be more than just the caretaker of others? The question echoed in my mind, each repetition louder than the last. Do you ever wonder if you're still seen? It wasn't that I had forgotten what it was like to be noticed. I remembered the days when I felt alive, when I was more than just a quiet observer of my own life. But somewhere along the way, I had stopped being seen, even by myself. I had let the routine of marriage and motherhood swallow me whole, until I was nothing more than a shadow of the woman I used to be. The quiet of the car seemed to stretch, wrapping around us, but I couldn't fill the silence. What was I supposed to say? I wasn't even sure I could explain the mix of emotions that flooded me. The sting of recognition was too much to bear. I had spent so long pretending everything was fine that the thought of confronting the truth felt overwhelming. I felt a lump form in my throat as I struggled to steady my breath. Was I really still the woman I used to be? Was I even me anymore? Or had I become a reflection of what I thought I should be? A wife, a mother, a caretaker. Those were the roles I had played so long. I had forgotten who I was when those titles were stripped away. I couldn't even remember the last time I'd done something for myself, just for the joy of it. It was as if the life I had built, the life I had accepted, was a cocoon I had wrapped myself in, too afraid to break free. Now, here I was, in the passenger seat of a car, with a man who barely knew me asking me a question that had cut straight to the core of who I had become. And in that moment, I realized I didn't have the answer. I didn't know when I had stopped being seen. The car slowed as we approached my street, the familiar houses and trees passing by in a blur. I didn't know what to say to James. How could I explain all the emotions that were tumbling inside of me, the self-doubt and the regret that had suddenly surfaced? How could I put into words the quiet sadness that had taken root in my heart? I didn't know. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't ignore what he had asked me. I couldn't ignore the truth that had been staring me in the face all this time. I wasn't the woman I had been, and I wasn't sure how to find her again. As James turned onto my street, I forced myself to breathe, to push away the weight of the question that had already begun to unravel me. It wasn't his fault. He didn't know the impact his words had on me. But in that moment, I felt more exposed than I had in years. For the first time, I saw myself for what I had become. A woman who had forgotten how to be seen, not just by others, but by herself. When I walked back into the house that evening, the familiar silence felt heavier than usual. It wasn't the usual peace I had learned to accept. No, this time it was different. The stillness seemed to press against me, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. Davy was in the bathroom, the sound of running water barely audible through the closed door. He had retreated into his world, just as he always did. I, on the other hand, was left with my thoughts. Thoughts that had been stirred up by a simple question, one that kept echoing in my mind, louder with every passing minute. Do you ever wonder if you're still seen? I moved through the house mechanically, pulling off my shoes and setting them aside, my fingers brushing against the cold hardwood floor. I was trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my chest, trying to push away the realization that had begun to settle in like a weight I couldn't shake off. But no matter how hard I tried, the question lingered. It had carved a space in my mind, and now it wouldn't leave. I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to confront the idea that I had somehow lost myself, that I had been living in a version of my life that no longer felt like mine. But as I stood there, in the stillness of the hallway, I couldn't ignore the truth. I wasn't just fading into the background of my own life. I had disappeared completely. And worse, I hadn't even noticed it happening. It had happened slowly over the years, in small, imperceptible ways. First, I stopped going out with friends. Then, I stopped pursuing the things I once loved. Gradually, I became consumed by my roles as a wife and mother, and everything that had made me me seemed to vanish. I had become nothing more than a shadow of the woman I used to be. I wandered into the kitchen, feeling the emptiness of the house press down on me. The walls, once filled with the sounds of my children running through the hallways, now seemed to close in, trapping me in my own thoughts. I opened the fridge and stared at the leftovers, wondering why I bothered with any of it. The dinners, the cleaning, the constant maintenance of this life that no longer felt like mine. It was as if I was performing a script I hadn't written, going through the motions without any real connection to what I was doing. In the quiet, I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. It was almost as though I had forgotten how I looked. The woman in the glass was someone I didn't recognize. She had wrinkles at the corners of her eyes, lines that had deepened over the years. Her hair, once full and vibrant, had lost its shine, now dull with the passage of time. But it wasn't just the physical changes that struck me. It was the emptiness in her eyes. The same eyes that had once sparkled with hope and ambition, now dimmed by the weight of years spent caring for others, years spent losing myself in the process. I had always told myself that I was content, that I was happy with the life I had built. But standing there, looking at myself, I realized that I wasn't content. I wasn't happy. I was lost. The woman in the mirror was a stranger to me. I didn't know when she had appeared, but she was there now, and I didn't know how to get her back. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about being forgotten by others, as James had implied. It was about me forgetting myself. I had let the years slip by, letting my roles define me, letting my identity be swallowed whole by the demands of others. I had sacrificed my own desires, my own needs, for the sake of keeping everything running smoothly. I had allowed myself to disappear. For the first time in a long time, I felt tears welling up in my eyes. It wasn't sadness, exactly. It was more like grief. Grief for the woman I had lost. Grief for the dreams that had faded away, and grief for the life I had allowed to slip through my fingers while I wasn't paying attention. I wanted to scream, to shake myself awake, but all I could do was stand there, frozen, staring at the reflection of a woman who no longer seemed to belong to me. I felt the knot in my chest tighten as I tried to process what had just hit me. I had spent so many years telling myself that I was fine, that this was what life was supposed to be. But now, I could no longer ignore the truth. I had become a shell of who I was. And as painful as it was to admit, I knew it was time for change. It wasn't going to be easy. The idea of stepping out of the roles I had built for myself, of reclaiming a part of me that had long been buried, felt overwhelming. What if I couldn't find her? What if the person I used to be was gone forever? These thoughts raced through my mind, but beneath the fear, there was something else. Something faint, but there. A spark of hope, maybe. The recognition that I could still change, still grow, still find myself again. I didn't know where to start, but I knew I couldn't keep living the way I had. I couldn't keep fading into the background of my own life. It was time to step forward, to find the parts of me that I had lost, to rediscover what it meant to be me. I wasn't sure what that journey would look like or how long it would take, but I knew that tonight, something had shifted. And maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. The next morning, I woke up with the weight of the previous day still hanging in the air. It wasn't a heavy burden, more like a realization, something that had been quietly shifting inside of me, and now I couldn't ignore it. It had started the night before, standing in front of the mirror, confronting the woman I had become. That feeling lingered, and I knew something needed to change, something deep inside me. But I hadn't expected to act on it so quickly. When I checked my phone later that morning, I saw a message from James. The simplicity of it caught me off guard. "Hey, would you like to join me for coffee today? No pressure, just thought it might be nice to chat." I read it several times, unsure of what to make of it. I wasn't sure why it mattered so much, why my heart seemed to flutter a little faster than usual. It wasn't a big deal, was it? But something in his message, in the way he offered no strings attached, no expectations, felt different. I stared at the screen for a while, feeling a strange sense of hesitation mixed with curiosity. I thought about my routine, about the things I had to do at home, about Davy and the way he was slipping further away from me, even though he was physically there. But then I remembered what I had been thinking about the night before. About me. About who I had become. This wasn't just about coffee. It wasn't about James. It was about me doing something for myself. Doing something that wasn't just about my responsibilities or my roles as a wife and mother. I needed this. I replied, deciding to go, and before I knew it, I was getting dressed and heading out the door. There was a strange sense of anticipation that I couldn't explain. I found myself walking to the cafe with a feeling I hadn't experienced in years. Freedom. I hadn't even realized how confined I'd become until that very moment, stepping out of my house and into the world as something other than a caretaker, a wife, or a mother. I was just me. The cafe was small, tucked away in a corner of the street, its walls lined with greenery and small plants that hung from the ceiling. It smelled of fresh coffee and earth, a comforting mixture of scents that grounded me immediately. I found a table by the window and sat down, trying not to seem too eager or anxious. I didn't want to appear as if this was a big deal, even though, for some reason, it felt like it was. James arrived shortly after, and when he walked in, I noticed how the sunlight caught in his dark hair, how his relaxed posture made him seem so at ease. I felt a moment of uncertainty, but he greeted me with the same calm smile, the same warmth, and suddenly, I felt a bit lighter. It wasn't about anything romantic, not at all. It was just the way he looked at me, The way he seemed genuinely interested in who I was, not just as a wife or mother, but as a person. We sat there for the next 2 hours, talking about everything and nothing. We discussed books, the little quirks of life, and even shared some laughter over trivial things. But what struck me wasn't what we talked about. It was the way I felt as I spoke. It had been so long since I had shared thoughts like these. So long since someone had really listened without rushing to change the subject or turn the conversation to something else. With James, there was no judgment, no expectation. I wasn't a part of anyone else's life at that moment. I was just me. I realized then that I'd forgotten what it felt like to just exist for myself. To be seen not as a role, not as a caretaker or a mother, but as a woman with her own thoughts, her own interests. James didn't look at me the way Davy did. He didn't see me through the lens of the life I had built with him, the quiet routines we had fallen into. He saw me as I was in that moment. Someone who had something to say, someone who was worthy of attention, not because of my family roles, but because of who I was. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that I had been invisible for far too long. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic turning point. But as we sat there, I felt a shift within me. I wasn't just sitting in a cafe, having coffee with a colleague. I was sitting in a space where I was truly seen. And for once, I didn't feel like a shadow in my own life. I felt like I mattered, not because I was fulfilling a duty, but because I existed in this world, capable of having meaningful interactions, capable of feeling things, of being more than just a caretaker. When the time came to leave, I stood up, feeling lighter, almost as if something had been lifted off my shoulders. James thanked me for coming, his smile genuine, warm. There was no hidden agenda, no complicated emotions. It was simple, but it meant more than he could have known. As I left the cafe and stepped out into the sunlight, I couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet joy. Not because of anything specific, but because I was beginning to realize that my life wasn't over. It hadn't ended the day my kids moved out or the day my marriage became routine. I was still here, and I could still be more than I had let myself become. That evening, when I returned home, the house didn't feel as heavy. It still had its silence, its quiet routine, but I no longer felt suffocated by it. I was beginning to understand that my life wasn't just a series of roles I had to fulfill. I was still me. Someone with desires, with a voice, with the ability to change. And that was a feeling I had almost forgotten. The morning after my coffee with James, I woke up to the familiar sounds of the house. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint rustle of the leaves outside in the early spring breeze. Everything was exactly the same. And yet, it felt different. I felt different. The shift in me hadn't been dramatic. There had been no grand epiphany, no sudden revelation that turned my life upside down. But something had changed in my perspective. I had finally seen myself again, and that simple act of recognition had given me a sense of clarity I had long been missing. It was like the fog that had clouded my vision had finally lifted, and I could see the road ahead of me clearly for the first time in years. But there was still something that needed to be addressed. I knew that I couldn't go on living as I had been, not if I wanted to find a way forward. The quiet realization had been with me for a while, and now it was undeniable. I needed to talk to Davy. We needed to have a real conversation, one that went beyond the surface of our routines and into the heart of what had been missing for so long. I spent most of the morning thinking about how I would start. What would I say? How could I explain to him that for years I had felt like I had been disappearing? How could I make him understand that it wasn't just about our marriage? It was about me. About who I had become and who I needed to find again, Davy had always been the quieter one between us. He was content with the way things were, with the predictable rhythm of our life together. I couldn't fault him for it. He loved me in his own way, and we had built a life together that, on the outside, seemed solid. But I'd grown tired of pretending that everything was okay when, deep down, I knew it wasn't. I had been holding myself back for too long, trying to fulfill roles that weren't truly mine anymore. And now, for the first time in years, I was ready to step into my own life again. When Davy came home that evening, I asked him to sit down with me. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as we settled at the dining table. He looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, sensing that something was different. He didn't know what it was, but he could feel it. I wasn't sure how to start, but I knew I had to. The words came slowly at first, but once I began, they flowed more easily. I told him how I had been feeling for so long, how I had felt like I had disappeared, swallowed whole by the roles I'd taken on. I talked about how, over the years, I had lost touch with who I really was, how I had become nothing more than a caretaker, a mother, a wife. I told him that I needed more than just comfort, more than just stability. I needed to find myself again, to reclaim parts of me that had been buried beneath the weight of our everyday life. It wasn't an easy conversation, and there were moments when the words stuck in my throat, when I wasn't sure if I was even making sense. But Davy listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to explain or defend himself. He just listened, his gaze steady and focused on me. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was truly being seen. There was no shouting, no accusations, just a quiet exchange of truths. Davy didn't have all the answers, and neither did I. But that was okay. The important thing was that we were talking, really talking, for the first time in years. And as the conversation unfolded, I realized something crucial. I didn't need to have all the answers. I didn't need to know exactly what my future looked like or how I was going to change. All I needed was the space to start again, to find my way forward, to take the first step toward rediscovering who I was. Davy's response was measured, thoughtful. He didn't make any promises or offer any quick fixes. Instead, he asked me what I needed from him, what kind of support I was looking for. It was a simple question, but it felt like the beginning of something real. For the first time, it felt like we were on the same page, like we were both willing to do the work, even if we didn't know exactly what that work would look like. I didn't have an immediate answer. I didn't know what I needed from him, or from anyone for that matter. But in that moment, I knew that I had taken a crucial step. I had opened the door to a new chapter in my life, and that alone was enough to give me the strength to move forward. As the evening wore on, the weight that had been hanging over me for so long began to lift, just a little. The house didn't seem as heavy anymore, and even though I still had a long way to go, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for years. I wasn't sure where this new path would take me, but I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer invisible. I had found myself again, and now I could begin to rebuild my life, one small step at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a quiet sense of hope. I knew it wouldn't be easy, and there would be moments of doubt, but I also knew that I was on my way to something better. And for the first time in years, that was enough.